Welcome to DLA Piper. My name is Hugo Munterkås, and I head the group for compliance, ESG, risk management here in Oslo. And together with BNCC and the Norwegian Chapter of the International Churchill Society, we are very happy to be able to host a fireside chat with Emma Soames, granddaughter of Sir Winston Churchill, and also Frode Kielland Asmyhr, beklager, who is then the chair of the International Churchill Society here in Norway. After the fireside chat, we will have a panel discussion between distinguished experts on the relevance of Sir Winston Churchill for world trade today, which will be very interesting. We live in a world where the West and Europe especially is fighting a number of battles. We are fighting for Ukraine, we are fighting for human rights, and we're fighting for the environment. We're fighting against the global warming and also climate change. And then finally, we are fighting a re-emerging geopolitical battle to secure the West and our own interests geographically and also technologically. And these battles are not only fought politically and in a military manner, but are also more and more visible in the legal and regulatory landscape. A clear trend that we as lawyers observe is that businesses and companies in Europe and in Norway, for that matter, are given more and more responsibilities in these battles. In relation to Ukraine, this has been very evident with the massive amount of sanctions that have been imposed by the EU, Norway, US, other Western countries, with of course an aim to pressure Russia to stop the war in Ukraine. Sanctions require that companies make sure that they don't breach the sanctions, of course, and don't do business with Russians or prohibited business with Russia. But it also entails that companies need to use resources to make sure that they're not doing business with sanctioned parties or someone that is owned by a sanctioned party. And also that they make sure that they don't contribute in circumventing the sanctions, which we see may be an issue, at least today. And these rules then make the businesses a sort of first line of enforcers of the political sanctions that are imposed by the states. In relation to human rights, we see the same trend. With the Norwegian Transparency Act and also the coming EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It's a long regulation, CSDDD. According to these rules, the Norwegian businesses, they will need to do due diligence on their supply chains globally. The rules entail that you need to understand who you're doing business with and who you are receiving services from, supplying goods from. And you have to identify the risk of human rights breaches and bad working conditions in the supply chain. And, and you also have to mitigate these risks globally. And in the same way as with sanctions, we see that these new rules, they are in a way of the states and jurisdictions are expanding their legal jurisdiction and reach, making European companies enforce Western policies globally through their supply chains, which is quite interesting. In relation to climate and the sustainability, we see the same trend through regulations such as the taxonomy, the CSRD, and again the CSDDD, where companies now have to report and monitor their own sustainability and climate footprint in a much greater manner. Today, globally, there is about 300 reporting regimes that global companies need to follow and comply with, which is, of course, a big challenge for companies, even though they're global. Of course, this has again led to a strong focus on moving away from fossil fuels and other polluting industries to sources of energy in industries that are more environmentally friendly, and we see this every day. Finally, in order to secure geopolitical interests and technology, we see an emerging regulation of FDI regulations, foreign direct investment regulation, for example, as the one we have in the Norwegian Security Act, where companies, where we have rules that govern what type of companies, Norwegian companies, that foreign or third world countries are not allowed to purchase or acquire in Norway, in order to secure Norwegian security interests. And for some countries and companies, these developments where companies are giving us bigger role in political questions and more responsibilities, the change has been quite quick. And in some situation, it has created, one may say, a cultural collision between political demands and what has normally been the focus of businesses. And these collisions may even have made sanctions and similar regulations less effective than may be intended in some situations, at least now initially. The development described has also been a predominantly Western phenomenon, not copied by too many third world countries, which is something that so far maybe also has restricted the efficiency of some of these imposed measures, such as sanctions, maybe specifically. And these are observations from a legal point of view, from us lawyers. But it will be interesting, I think, to see what the effects of many of these regulations will be, both geopolitically and sustainability globally. But it will also be interesting to see over time how these new regulations will affect the Western economy, of course, and the geopolitical position of Western countries going forward. I'm very sure that Winston Churchill would have had an opinion on all of these topics had he been with us today. And personally, I'm very much looking forward to hearing both Emma Soames and our panel of experts on any guidance we may derive from his wisdom that he shared while he was with us. With that, I would like to introduce Emma Soames and Hans Frode Kielland Asmyhr, who will begin with the fireside chat about the man and the legend. Yes, thank you.
First of all, thank you, and let me, on behalf of the International Churchill Society, thank DLA Piper and British-Norwegian Chamber of Commerce for co-hosting this event with us here tonight. And a warm welcome to everyone that's chosen to do this in a busy time. We know it's that before Christmas. And especially a warm welcome to you, Emma. You are a British editor, journalist, and author. You have been an editor of various famous British publications, as the Literary Review, Tatler, Evening Standard Magazine, Telegraph magazine and others. 2 years ago, you published this book, Mary Churchill's War, your mother's wartime diaries, and that's very interesting to see her view on her father's work in this important time. You are the daughter of Mary Churchill and Christopher Soames, and your father was a MP for many years, minister, and Churchill's right hand. Both of your parents were members of the House of Lords. Your brother is a member of the House of Lords today. And why we're here today, Emma, is that you are the granddaughter of Sir Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine. And Sir Winston Churchill, a person that at the millennium was voted by his own countrymen as the greatest Englishman ever. Greater than Lord Nelson, greater than the Beatles, and all your famous footballers.
Yeah.
What makes this person so special?
Well, can I just, before I start, add my thanks to DLA Piper and the Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this event and for being so generous in inviting me to join you for the inauguration of the Norwegian chapter of the International Churchill Society, which is absolutely delightful, and it's wonderful to see the name and memory of my grandfather spreading throughout the free world.
What makes him so special? Is the greatest Englishman ever.
Well, I mean, he was the most extraordinary mixture of, well, first of all, there was no difference between how he was in public and how he was in private. He was the same man. And he had these extraordinary qualities. You know, the fact that he could read a piece of poetry from beginning to end that he hadn't read for 30 years, and astound people who might say, quote one line of it, and then he would go off into this, you know, read the entire thing. And my mother writes of vivid memories, because of course she was, you know, she was the youngest of his 5 children. She was brought up at Chartwell. There was a big age gap between her and her next sibling, so she was effectively an only child. And she sat at the dining room table at lunches and dinners, and he would go off in these great riffs of poetry, speeches, historical quotations, and she was spellbound from an early age. And so he had that quality, and then he had these qualities of leadership, of his courage, his vision, his oratory. That is not to say that he didn't get things wrong.
Today, you have been to the Norwegian Parliament, and you met the President of the Parliament, and the British-Norwegian caucus, Friendship Caucus in the Parliament, and they gave you a very nice copy of Sir Winston Churchill's speech to the Parliament here in Norway in 1948, as the first foreign person able to speak to the Parliament. He was initially invited in 1946, but because of his Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, the Norwegian government got a little bit nervous, and they forced the king to write to Churchill and ask if he could come later on. And the king wrote, we would hope you can come when things has calmed down a little bit. And Churchill wrote back and he said, thank you, I will come back when things has calmed down or got worse. And this is a good example of the great wit Churchill had. There's thousands of quotations.
Yeah.
Not all of them might be true, but what do you and the family remember of this wit? Was he a funny person as a private person?
Well, there is quite a famous story, largely famous because my brother tells it all the time. But my eldest brother, who's a little bit older than me, he's called Nicholas, and we brought up at Chartwell, so we spent a lot of time with our grandparents. And he went running into his grandfather's study, which was like, you know, the Holy of Holies. You weren't supposed to do that. He said, "Grandpapa, Grandpapa, I hear you're the greatest living Englishman." And he said, "Yes, now bugger off."
But do you think people got hurt from his comments? We have this, the famous one. He apparently told Lady Astor told him that Winston, you're drunk, and he said,
"And tomorrow we'll be sober."
Sober, and you will still be ugly. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I mean, he could be cruel. You know, by present-day standards, I would consider that to be rather cruel. But he just had this amazing wit, and it sort of flowed out of him. You know, like when Hitler sent him a telegram, or because there was something about, he was a chicken, and he said, "Some chicken, some neck."
Yeah.
You know, it just flowed off the end of his tongue. There was nothing worked up about it. He didn't have, like many famous comics now, he didn't have a scriptwriter in behind him.
But we're talking about the person that got the Nobel Peace Prize,
Prize for
literary prize.
Yeah.
So he had some extraordinary talents.
He did. I mean, he was a wonderful writer. I'm just reading his biography of Marlborough, which was an early thing he wrote. But I mean, it's massive. It's that big, but it's beautifully written. I mean, I take it that I will assume that it's historically accurate. I have nothing to compare it with, but it is beautifully written. So he had the muse, so to speak.
Are there any members of the family that inherited this sense of humor, special sense of humor? We know you Brits have an extraordinary sense of humor, but...
Yeah, well, we do our best. My brother Nicholas is very, very funny. And he's very good at telling stories against himself, like, yes, I am the greatest, now bugger off. So he's very good. So, yes, but I mean, nobody tries to... I'll say one thing for my family. I'm sure we have many shortcomings, but we do not try to compete with the amazing memory of our grandfather.
Yeah.
That would be very silly.
You said you grew up at Chartwell, and Chartwell is property in Kent where Churchill lived for 40 years.
Yes.
What are your memories from growing up there? What are your, the first memories of your grandparents, of your grandfather? Yes. Not to tell your age, but you're born between his two... No,
I'm perfectly happy to tell my age.
Between his two prime minister periods.
Well, the fact is that when I knew my grandfather, I saw a lot of my grandparents, but I was very, very young and he was very, very old. So he was not making great witty remarks and asking my opinion about the future of democracy. And if he had, I mean, even if he told me things about the future of democracy, they would have gone over my head. So I really remember him as a very dear old man. What I do remember is that the entire household worked around him. He still had security. He had servants who'd been with him for a very long time. And you very much had the feeling that everybody, the whole of Chartwell, lived and worked to make his old age happy and content. And it did make him happy and content, because he was in the house that he'd fallen in love with 40 years before. It had the most amazing views. I don't know how many people have been there, but it's built on the side of a hill overlooking the Weald of Kent. And so what I remember mainly is him sitting there with a weak whiskey and soda and a large cigar and a huge hat, looking peacefully at the scenery. And his many animals. So what I really remember is the budgerigar, the dog, Rufus, etc., etc.
Was he a caring grandfather? You say he was an old man, but he was prime minister also at that time, so it couldn't be that that old, But
no,
we know he was in his 70s. But was he a caring grandfather, or did he get annoyed of your children hustling around?
No. If we got annoying, we were removed from the scene of the crime, I'm sure. But he used to come. He built this swimming pool. He had all these things he did in the grounds of Chartwell. He created, there was this water coming down from a spring in the hillside, and he created riverways and ponds where he had his famous fish, his goldfish, and then on down into the valley where he created this vast swimming pool with a heating system, but it was still as cold as the North Sea up here.
It's still there.
And he used to come down and watch us swim, and then we would all go up the hill and have tea on the lawn, and he would sit with us while we ate our little sandwiches. And my grandmother was an ever-present presence, and she was very concerned about his happiness, as indeed was my mother, who had been at his side, really at her parents' side, from the beginning of the war onwards.
Yeah. What was your grandmother Clementine's role in the family, and how was the interaction between your grandparents?
They were very sweet together. I mean, they'd entered a peaceful old age together, but she was, I think, 10 years younger than him. So she was that much younger. And I think she was quite relieved not to be running a house with 57 civil servants running through it, running a house at war, moving from Chequers to number 10 Downing Street every weekend. I think she was probably quite relieved that that time of their life was over. But they were very sweet together. I became very close to my grandmother because my grandfather died in, I think, 1965. And my grandmother didn't die for another 10 years or so. And I used to go and spend time with her in London and stay with her. And she was the most elegant woman. And she had very strong ideas of her own. And Edward Heath became very, very fond of her.
So she was tough with him on his views, and
Yeah.
Did she have any influence on his policies?
My God.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And for instance, about the abdication, occasionally my grandfather got things royally wrong, and one of these things was the abdication, and she put him right, and she changed his opinion.
When, as a young girl, did you realize that your grandfather was one of the most famous persons in the world?
His funeral.
His funeral?
Yeah.
Not before that?
It's rather sad, not till then, but Well, it was the most impressive event I've ever attended in my entire life.
Yeah. The state funeral.
The state funeral, and going in carriages. The women, the boys followed the coffin, and the girls, we were put in carriages, horse-drawn carriages, and all the way we went, there were people standing 4 or 5 deep. I mean, I think all England was there practically. And it was the expression on people's faces, and these old men with their caps on their chest, holding their grandchildren aloft because they wanted them to remember that they'd seen Winston Churchill, if only in his death. And I was absolutely flabbergasted and deeply moved by it. And then, of course, we got to St. Paul's Cathedral, and we were right up the top. And there was the Queen, and normally by protocol the Queen was the last person to arrive, but in this case she was not the last person to arrive, the family was the last to arrive. So she was in her place when we arrived, as were most of the royalty of Europe. And then the first hymn was the battle hymn of the Republic, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And there was this shaft of sunlight came through the high window of St. Paul's and fell on the coffin. You know, it was an absolutely extraordinary moment. And then I was standing at the front of the barge on the way to Waterloo Station and there were the cranes coming down in this wonderful gesture. So it was just unforgettable. It really was. And it was at that moment I realized that, I mean, I don't want to pretend I didn't know he was a good and a great man before that, but I didn't realize quite how globally significant and how deeply people minded about him.
But there must have been a lot of famous people coming in and out of Chartwell, you know.
But not when I mean, no. I lived, you know, down the hill. You know, we had a nanny, we lived in the nursery, we weren't brought up when all these famous politicians came to call. We were, if anything, sent home. But I remember my grandmother playing croquet with various people. I can't quite remember who they were, but the Asmyhr family, and so, you know, but we were really part of their leisure time rather than their working time.
You mentioned Churchill's 5 children. How could you say something about, you know, their relationship to their father? You know, must have been hard to grow up in the limelight of such a big personality.
Yes. I think Randolph, his eldest son, or his only son, found it particularly different. And I think, in the opinion of my mother, in her diaries, this comes out, my grandfather he was a very old-fashioned man. He was very old-fashioned. He was Edwardian. So all his hopes were pinned on Randolph, you know, who was going to inherit. Quite what he was going to inherit, I don't know, because, you know, there was no Blenheim. But he spoilt Randolph. And of course, Randolph ended up having terrible rows with his mother, and terrible rows with his father at a time when the war was at its height and Winston was under great pressure. And so he was banned. He was banned from the house because it was just it was very, very sad and unfortunate. And then Diana died young, Sarah died, and the last one living was my mother. And it's a terrible thing to say that somebody was the favourite daughter, But I think she did more for her parents than any of the other children in various ways.
In this book, Your Mother's Wartime Diaries, it's very apparent that she adores her father very much. You know, she says, Papa that.
Yeah.
I'm so, concerned about him, you know. And she also goes with him very often when he has these important speeches in the House of Commons, as the Norway debate, for example.
Yes.
You had a very good
Shall I
quotation there from the Norway,
Don't
what
worry,
she writes
it's not
about the
very
Norway.
long. This is Wednesday, the 8th of May, 1940. The debate on the Norwegian campaign continued throughout today. Attacks, queries, suspicions and suggestions came from all sides of the House. Papa rose to wind up the debate. It was the first time in 11 years that he had wound up for the government. The House was in a most uncertain, unpleasant and restless mood. Frequent interruptions, also quite a lot of cheering. Papa's handling of the actual matter and of the House was nothing short of superb. And I'm just going to read you one more short bit, which wasn't the Norway debate, but just to give you an idea of how brilliant he was in the House of Commons. This was when we scuppered the French fleet, which was like an arrow to the heart of many English people who adored the French, but they, you know, otherwise the Germans were going to get hold of it. This afternoon, Mummy and Pam, that was at that point Mrs. Randolph Churchill, and I went to the house. It was a very sad day for Papa, he who has always loved and admired the French so much and worked so much for the Entente Cordiale. His statement was sombre, sorrowful but resolved. He explained the situation and the government's action to a gloomy, crowded, attentive house. When, after nearly an hour, he sat down, the house began to cheer. The cheering grew and grew until the house was on its feet. So, even in the darkest hour, he could bring the House of Commons to its feet.
She writes very lively around, you know, him and how much she adores him. We know that Churchill had a very difficult relationship with his own parents. You know, Lord Randolph Churchill, a famous politician in his time, son of a duke, and Jenny Jerome, the American. How did that influence his own, you know, his own relationship with his own family, you know, children and grandchildren, and, you know, that difficulty he had with his parents?
You know, I think many people who have a very difficult upbringing and difficult relationship with their own parents are determined not to repeat it with their own children. And I've seen this, you can read this endlessly in many relationships. And I think Grandpapa was like that. But I also think he was very much supported by Clementine, who soothed him, knocked sense into him occasionally when he had slightly crazy ideas. But he adored he loved his children. But my mother had a quite sort of privileged position because she was so young. So all the other children had left home and she was at Chartwell. You know, she went to school in a local school. She had a menagerie. She had goats and sheep and goodness knows what else in the garden. And she was never kept away behind the green baize door. You know, so she ate with her parents and spent a lot of time with them. So, and I think he came to treasure her, rather.
Yeah. A couple of other things, and that is Churchill's alcohol consumption. People think he drank a lot, and a bottle of whiskey, champagne for lunch,
Yeah.
cognac in the afternoon,
yeah.
things like that. Is this true, or is it
Well, my mother always said that he did drink whiskey for breakfast or whatever it was, but that his drinks were always incredibly weak. He just liked having a drink next to him. And I suppose I do slightly remember, sitting in the garden with him. He always had a little table and there was a drink on it. But it didn't look like Scottish whiskey at its strongest. So I just think he was a chugger, you know what I mean? But anyway, whether he did or whether he didn't, he died at 90. He was not bright yellow when he died. And he managed to win a world war.
Yeah.
I rest my case.
Churchill's black dog, some of writers have written
Yes.
that he had some kind of mental challenges.
Yeah, and I think he suffered from depression.
Yeah, he called it my black dog.
It's a great expression.
Yeah.
A black dog sitting on your shoulder. And I think he did suffer from that, but I think the war would have been keeping busy would have been a very powerful distraction from that. And plus which he had the love of a good woman. It does help.
Yeah, sure. Before we end, we need to say a few words around Churchill's relevance today. This old man with a cigar, born in the 1800s. What kind of relevance do you think Churchill has today? But it's just to see here how many people showed up tonight.
Well, indeed. It's so thrilling and flattering that this is the case. And in a sense, it's not to do with the old man, it's to do with the ideas and his character and his characteristics. But I mean, many other people here tonight will have much clearer ideas than I do. I mean, I don't like to put words into my grandfather's mouth about what would he think about, say, Ukraine. But, the ideas that he espoused and the ideas that won of freedom, liberty, are still going strong today and never more important than today.
Okay, Emma, thank you very much for sharing your memories and views on your very famous grandfather. And of course, we in Norway, we are very grateful for his efforts and his ability to stand up for democracy. So thank you very much to your family for that.
Well, I will pass it on.
Thank you very much. Feel like a weak whiskey now. My name is Håkon Borud. I'm the chair of the British-Norwegian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm going to lead the panel. And we're going to discuss the really demanding and challenging bits now, like liberty, like freedom, Russian aggression, human rights, statesmanship, political leadership, democracy, free trade, and if we have the time, we might even dive into China. I'm not going to talk about any of this, because I don't know that much about it. But we have an extremely well-known panel, Jan, if you could come up as well, please, that I will introduce, and I'm over 50 years old, so I need glasses. All right, so with us in uniform, Geir Hågen Karlsen, you've all seen him on TV, I think. Lieutenant Colonel and Director of Strategic Communications for the Norwegian Defence University College. Armed Forces leading expert on strategic influence operations, strategic communication, information operations, and psychological operations as well. Didn't know that. Senior Staff Officer at Armed Forces Crisis Staff. And he walks, talks, and sleeps crisis, so we will hear a lot about it. And Janne, we can wait with you. Yes, you're getting then. Yeah, you're coming. Yngve Kvistad, commentator at Verdens Gang, Norway's largest newspaper. It hurts my heart a little bit coming from Aftenposten in my time, but okay.
It's the same owner.
Yes. An author and a bit of a Churchill expert. And then Janne Håland Madlari, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Your CV is as long as a book in itself, so I can't read it all. But Professor of International Politics at the University of Oslo and Norwegian Defence University College. Used to be, or has been, a State Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Visiting Professor at University of Notre Dame. Research Associate at Pembroke College, Oxford University. And you've written so many books that I can't talk about them all, but you've written a book about, or you've been an editor for a book for military strategy in the 21st century, The Challenge for NATO, and Britain's defense role after Brexit. Welcome all. Hi, Matthew. Thank you. So we're just going to dive into the, I don't know, the most depressing part of this evening, I think, Russian aggression. Something Churchill was very, very aware of, and you've already been told about the Iron Curtain speech. And he said, just one little quote, "I cannot forecast to you the actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interests." So I think that's a really good start, Geir Hågen. I think maybe you could tell what's the situation on the ground. Everybody here would like to hear what's the situation on the ground now. Any good news?
Well, sorry, Håkon, no good news about Ukraine today. But first, Madam, fascinating to learn firsthand about your grandfather. Very interesting, so thank you. When it comes to the situation on the ground there, it's pretty much a frozen conflict. The Russians are holding more than 100,000 square kilometers, and they have dug in hundreds of thousands of troops. And as far as we can see, whatever the foreseeable future is, there is no likelihood that any of the parties will prevail militarily. And that's, I have three scenarios, and that's the first one, and the most most likely one is we're confronted with a very long war of attrition. Another scenario is a peace agreement that requires that both parties will actually go into peace agreement, and none of them will do that right now, and President Putin will not do it. We think he will not do it as long as he's leading Russia, which means we can be having this challenge for a long time. Third scenario is a sort of breakdown on the Russian side. That was a pretty far-fetched idea until the 24th of June, when the Wagner group turned around 180 degrees and marched on Moscow to remove the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Defense, downing at least 6 Russian military helicopters and an airplane from the Russian Air Force. That shows that under the strong facade of the regime, there is certainly a lot of tension. Whether it's likely, don't know, but it's a possibility. So that's the news about the Eastern Front today. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I recommend all of you, wherever you work and whatever you're doing, be prepared to handle a very long war and some nasty surprises. Nasty surprise might be a nuclear accident, industrial accident where IEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, has warned about this for almost 2 years.
or a missile hitting a schoolyard in Poland, killing 50 kids, or something like that. Might be a brutal morning. That's what we're facing. But you asked what Sir Winston would do. Yeah, I think this is his most famous quote. Never give in. Never, 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 never give in. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing right now. They will not give in. So we just have to help them keep that going till something changes the situation on the ground, or politically in Moscow.
Matlari, Putin is not Hitler, and the war in Ukraine is not the Second World War, but certainly the quotes from Winston Churchill is it's a relevant quote today.
Yes, I think he certainly recognized that the world is a place with a lot of, wouldn't say evil, but a lot of hard-nosed interests, and that the Russians are not liberal democrats. Not then, the Soviets, not now. My youngest daughter, Sophie, she used to say when she was little, "Give me an ice cream now and I shall not start to scream." So this is the Russian way of negotiation. It's a maximalist, showing power, showing willingness to be tough, and if you're weak, you are losing. It's a zero-sum logic. And we are in the West, in liberal democracy, we think the world is a win-win proposition, and that it's really stupid to have a zero-sum logic. But I think we're dealing with Russia. Before I came here, I watched the news that Finland has closed all but one border crossing from Russia to Finland because of this weaponization of migration. And this is, this is so primitive, yet it is happening, it has happened before and will happen again. So we have to be able to counter all these grey zone attacks. Russia is at war with us. We are not at war with Russia militarily, but in the grey zone we are. And this is, I think, a very unwelcome reality which we try to avoid accepting. And I think Sir Winston would have been very adamant and clear that this is reality. We have to face reality, and we have to have courage and statesmanship in devising strategy. And when I look around in Europe, I don't see any leaders that have this propensity, this courage, this risk willingness, because strategic interaction, if you're going to prevail, you have to be able to take risk. You have to have personal courage. And I don't see politicians that want to rise to the occasion. They rather try to be reactive and avoid trouble. So now here we are with Russia, as you say, in a clearly adversarial relationship for many, many years to come. We may have escalation up to this extremely dangerous situation of tactical nuclear weapons. We may have grey zone attacks for years. We will have sanctions for years, most certainly. For you in business, you are collateral damage in this war. And we will have this unpleasantness of having to deal with Russia and be courageous enough to have a strategy to counter Russia, because they will only understand this sort of strong will, courage, willingness to face confrontation. And one could, perhaps Sir Winston would have pointed out that the gross domestic product of France, Britain and Germany put together is far bigger than the GDP of Russia, which is similar to Spain's. So Russia is in a way a gas station with nukes, as General Petraeus said. That's a bit nasty, but they can take it.
But you've said several times Norwegian politicians have not taken into, they haven't really woken up to a new reality in Europe. You said that many times. In here you are mostly business leaders. What about business leaders? Do we actually understand what's going on, and what can we do other than prepare our value chains?
Yes, I think you are forced into this reality. You are the ones that suffer mostly from sanctions. You risk American extraterritorial sanctions if you deal with anybody that the US sanctions, and they are many. And you have to be extremely careful. You should trade, when you trade with China, which one certainly should, there should be a strategic analysis of the relationship, who is the most dependent on whom. We did that for a long time with Russian gas from the mid-80s. I started working on this in my first job in the Oil and Energy Ministry, and then it was all about Ronald Reagan, Russian gas, who's dependent on whom. One never resolved the issue, but one thought this is win-win. He gets, the Russians get the money, we get the gas, it's a win-win. And so it was, until it wasn't anymore. So now Russia has cut off that extremely lucrative deal, the gas. It shows that they are willing to, and the Chinese may also be willing to, do such things. So what the Americans call now de-risking and decoupling, all these these terms that are not very elegant, that's you have to do the power analysis of, can you take a confrontation if it comes to one? You should trade, but you should not be the dependent party. So all of this is new. This is what you have to do as business, in your own business, and then you have to observe all the sanctions, all the political changes, discussions, whether the Americans and the Europeans are splitting up on China. Are they disagreeing on China, which is a big possibility that they may. So here, there's a lot for you to do, and I think politicians so far have had the easiest time, because they have, in a way, they've been reactive, and it is again the US that has led regarding the war in Ukraine.
Geir and Carlsen, you said we must not show weakness. I'm going to throw quotes at you all night. So listen, this is what Winston Churchill said. From what I have seen of our Russian friends during the war, I'm convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength. And there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness, especially military weakness.
Absolutely agree.
Right, wasn't he?
I've been working with the Russians for quite a lot, and I was liaison to Russian troops in the Balkans for many months, and I've been there many times. Agree 100%. They will always test you as militaries, politically. That's what they're doing with the Finns right now. They're testing the Finns politically. And you just punch them on the nose, whatever that means in where you're standing. Poke your finger in their eye, whatever it takes. They will respect it. And then you can have business as usual afterwards. But if you show weakness, they will play their games and you will just be pushed along. That goes for countries, it goes for military exchanges, it goes for business, everything. I'm sure those of you that have worked with Russian business knows this very well. It's the first thing they will do is to test you, see if you're strong enough.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go along. Next year there are 3 huge elections in the world: UK, US, and the EU. So if you think democracy is a weak institution, then maybe next year will be the year to create turmoil around the world. Am I right in this, or?
Well, it kind of looks like that. We also had this election now in Holland, in the Netherlands, yesterday, which also showed that the ultra-right is on its move. I just want to go back to the quote you mentioned, the first quote you had there, because that's quite typical for Churchill, and is one of his phenomenal qualities, and that's his foresight. He predicted Hitler and the Nazis and the war long before, because he was a historian. He knew the Prussians. He had seen it all coming. Same thing about Stalin and the Iron Curtain. He foresaw that as well. Because he was a historian. He had read lots and lots. Whenever he was in the army and at Sandhurst, when his comrades there wanted to go out and have a drink or play or something, he would go to his room and read, studied all the time. So he knew his military history, he knew his history, he knew his political history, And all this made him such a great analyst. I was losing my point there. Yeah, the election. Yeah.
He foresaw everything.
Yeah.
All the big pictures.
Yeah.
Yep. But you told me earlier that he was also a great politician because he admitted
His
faults.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, you have this. There are, of course, there are several things. Soames said that he had his misjudgments. He got the abdication wrong. He got the gold standard wrong. He got the suffragettes thing wrong. It was very old-fashioned. It was against the whole idea that women should have any voting rights. And of course, there was this Dardanelles situation, which he also got very wrong. But the one thing you learned from that was that because this was, I'm not sure that Geir Hågen could tell more about it, but this was a military situation in First World War in 1915 outside Constantinople, and the English Marine, they lost, I think it was about 5-6 naval ships. And this was due to a miscalculation by Winston Churchill, who was then the Lord of the Admiralty. But what he learned from that was that when the Second World War came, he would never, if he got an advice from the commanding chiefs of the military branches, if they were agreed upon something, he would never go against them. Even he had his constitutional right to do so. Some would say he also would have the military backup to say so. He was, of course, the prime minister. He was also the minister of defense. But if they had said something, he would never overturn them. He would not turn against them. And that was obviously because he had learned from his fault.
You respected knowledge.
Yeah, respected knowledge. Yeah.
All right. So not like today then, when any influencer is pretty much worth the same as anybody who's studied something for 20 years.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my personal opinion. But you work as a commentator in Norway's largest newspaper and work close to power, close to our politicians. What do you think? Do they admit mistakes, faults, learn from them?
Does it look that way? No, and that's another thing about Churchill. I would say that he showed leadership so profoundly. He was a torch in himself. He was a role model for not for all the politicians, but for I was going to say anyone. He had a moral and physical courage that no one else had. I mean, like when he was in the First World War, he was commanding. He was a lieutenant in the Scottish Army. He would never ever command any of his soldiers to do anything that he wouldn't dare to do. So it often happened that he did the things that some of the soldiers should have done. So he went out. He went out from. Went into the fields. He spied on the Germans. Sometimes they say that he was so close that he could hear the Germans discussing. So he was such he had this moral, as I said, and physical courage, and combined with the foresight and later on the eloquence, which I guess we'll talk about later. But it kind of made him the perfect leader and the perfect prime minister, and especially in that. Difficult times.
Mantlari, the first thing you said when you walked in here, you said we have to talk about him as a statesman and his political leadership. Does this?
Yes, I mean he, unlike politicians today, he knew the military tool of the state, ultima ratio regum. The last argument of the king is military power, and that means that military power is the only type of power that will do when there is a challenge of sovereignty of a state's existence and so on. this is completely foreign to the modern politician. We have states whose existence is challenged today. Russia wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. Hamas, the same with Israel. Two existential situations. This is completely unknown today. And then politicians today are not very well educated. We had some data on comparing cabinets across the globe, and the Nordic cabinets, the cabinet ministers have the least education in the whole world. The Africans are much better educated. In Germany, they have to have a doctorate even if they have to forge one. As we know, that's a bit difficult, a bit over the top. But there is so little knowledge of history, there's so little formation of those who become government ministers. And I think in general, history matters nothing today to the Brits, maybe to the educated French and so on. But in general, there is so little knowledge of history, maybe because everything is very relativistic, subjectivistic, emotional.
And
I feel that this war should end. Sort of emotions instead of rational argument.
Because you've been called a rationalist, haven't you, by your opponents?
Well, I hope that's a wonderful compliment to be a rationalist and realist. Yes.
Hard-nosed realist.
Hard-nosed realist.
I'm working with her.
Yeah. Well, this is, Sigrid Undset, our great author, Catholic convert. She said, I'm a realist in all things. One must be a realist in all things. And of course, learning from history, what you do in military academies is to read and learn, compare, discuss, learning from history. And there is changing character of war. I'm attached to this Oxford Changing Character War Centre. It's named the Changing Character War, but there is also a permanent nature of war. So the permanent nature is the basis for strategic interaction, and that's where states have to be able or the statesmanship has to be a virtue developed in politicians. But this is so far away from the current political scene, both in the US and in Europe.
Just to follow up, I think someone observed at the time some while back that EU was the first empire where military knowledge had absolutely no relevance at all for the leadership. But that said, I think we shouldn't underestimate the political ability to actually learn from the situation and stand up to the challenges. Look at President Zelensky in Ukraine. He was an actor. He's probably of the same class as your grandfather.
Yeah.
There will be statues of him all around Ukraine, wherever that war ends, for sure. But also our own leaders. I think we shouldn't underestimate the change that we've experienced from the outset of the war in February last year, where everyone was pretty scared about what the Russians would do, and we're now in a situation. It has taken 1.5 years or even more, where there is a lot more will to provide the Ukrainians with advanced weapons. I don't think the politicians are the challenge there. It's actually the electorate, because there is a risk that if this winter becomes cold and dark and expensive, and then the populist parties might win somewhere around Europe and going against the support for Ukraine. I think that's the biggest challenge we have right now, not the leaders. Just look back at the COVID period. We had heads of state able to tell their population that we have to do a lot of difficult, challenging, and very expensive things to maintain health in the population. And we have to go back to China after, before we quit here, because that's going to be
I'm just going to follow the flow. Challenge. If you want to talk about China, we'll dive into it. But Emma Soames, you are the real Churchill expert here. What does it sound like to you?
It has great echoes of what I know about my grandfather, and there are probably many people in this room who probably technically know more about him than I do. But it is also true that in the 1930s, the political class was pretty weak, as it is now. And it's almost a sort of precursor.
Yeah, exactly.
So everything you said has a sort of ring of hideous possibility about it. And it's been a long time since we've had a Putin. So everybody's got very cozy in front of the fire, and then this is all very inconvenient, and it doesn't fit with our worldview. But luckily there are a few people, such as President Zelensky, who are prepared to stand up and fight the good fight.
Kvista, you made a career out of creating words. Have a guess at this. Who said this? We will fight till the end. At sea, in the air, we will continue fighting for our land, whatever the cost. We will fight in the forest, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets. We will not give up.
We shall never surrender.
Who said that?
Winston Churchill.
No.
It
It was actually Zelensky.
was Zelensky. Okay.
Zelensky said that when he went to House of Commons.
Exactly.
Who do you think inspired him?
Well, but
He forgot the beaches.
He forgot the beaches.
They haven't got many of those.
Exactly.
Very
exactly.
few, very short.
Yeah.
there's an interesting story about that in this fantastic book by Andrew Roberts. If you should read one volume biography of Winston Churchill, read this one. I'm sure many of you has read Roy Jenkins and some of the other voluminous biographies, but this one is fantastic. And this is actually the 1010th biography about Winston Churchill. And until 2018, there were only 1009 biographies. This was 1010.
So remember that every 1010.
Yeah. And
That's the one.
Yeah, and it's full of anecdotes, and it's you don't have to take my word for it, but it's actually the best one-volume biographies of Winston Churchill. Everybody in British press had said so, and one of the things that he, of course, analyzes and wants to dig into is the eloquence of Winston Churchill. Where did it come from? How could he compose these fantastic speeches? They all sounded, of course, that there was something that he made up as he stood there, but they were all worked out, and he had practiced on them, and all that. And at one time, his private secretary asked him, "How do you do it? I mean, what's the secret behind these speeches?" And he said, "Well, there are 4 things. And the first thing is you need each sentence need to convey one idea, and one idea only. That's the one thing. The second thing was keep the sentences short, but the words long. And then he said use the Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, the old English words which the peoples of England have known for 1,000 years. So when you wrote The Fight on the Beaches and the landing grounds, on the fields, on the streets, and all that, he used all those tricks in the book that he had made of himself. And if you look at the last paragraph, and the very most famous paragraph, it contains like 141 words. And all of them but 2 are in the Old English vocabulary, and it's not the landing grounds. They come from the dictionary of the Old English. The only 2 exceptions being the word confidence, which is from Latin, and the other one is surrender, which is French.
Okay, anybody Any French here? No. Okay. You wanted to talk about China. Let's talk about China. So actually, Churchill had an opinion on China as well, believe it or not. He said, ought we to recognize them, that this was the communist China, or not? He said, recognizing a person is not necessarily an act of approval. I will not be personal or give instance. One has to recognize lots of things and people in this world of sin and woe, and the one does not like. The reasons for having diplomatic relations is not to offer a compliment, but to secure a convenience. You've talked about China for every day, every night for weeks now, and you said we need to keep open dialogue with them and we need to trade with them.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go back to Sir Winston. He was a fervent advocate of free trade. But he also never hesitated to confront authoritarians, right? I think that's the two things we have to do when it comes to China. China is a partner. I'm sure for many of you it's a very important partner, whether you're importing or exporting to China. They're also definitely a security challenge. They're authoritarian states. They're stealing as much technology as they can from the West. That's one of the reasons why the US are limiting their access to the high-end technologies. And I think we have to find a balance between business, security, and other issues. Other issues might be human rights, it might be environment, transparency in supply chains, as Hugo mentioned earlier on today. And I think there are a number of cases in Norway now where everything with regards to China is dangerous, so stay away. I think that's totally flawed. I think we should reduce dependence on China on critical areas. Some minerals, some other issues. That will take a long time. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. And we have to reduce vulnerability. Example is, I know no companies in oil, gas, or power generation that will buy a control system for their infrastructure from China, right? But don't hesitate to buy a Chinese electrical car, for instance. That shouldn't be a problem. You have to reduce dependence to a...
So to buy a Volvo is okay?
Volvo is a Chinese car, at least Chinese owned.
And that's okay to buy?
Right, I don't care where you drive. I have an old diesel Toyota, so I'm happy. I don't care. That car is never going to tell me anything, tell me what I'm going to do.
Exactly.
So have fun with your electrical vehicle. No, but we have to reduce dependence to a sufficient level. Doesn't mean zero. To a level where we say we're not so vulnerable, and avoid vulnerabilities in key areas. If you do that, you can max out on business. I think we can do more business with China. A lot more business with China, as long as we are selectively reducing dependence and vulnerabilities in key areas. And that's a balance here. That will be fervently pro-business and trade, while we're also taking care of our own security.
Mandari.
Yes, you should think of the 5 C's. The first C is cooperation. You can all, we're all used to that, win-win. Then there's competition. We can cooperate and we can compete at the same time. That's normal business, that's normal liberal democracy. Then there is confrontation, conflict, coercion. Can you coerce your business partner if you need to, or can he coerce you, confront you, and you lose and he wins? Open conflict, difficult. So we have to, this repertoire of possible C's is the new menu, so to speak. And one has to master all the 5 C's, if possible. And that's certainly what, if you look at China, just yesterday an Australian warship was doing some diving, had some exercise doing some diving in the South China Sea, and a Chinese frigate didn't shoot at it, but used strong sonar, the sonar you use for detecting submarines, which could have killed the divers, which is an extremely aggressive behavior. And this is the kind of military testing and aggression that we see a lot of from the Russians and from the Chinese. So certainly the Chinese are extremely aggressive diplomatically and in terms of testing the waters, literally, in the South China Sea and vis-a-vis Taiwan. So we shouldn't be naive. We must be realistic and then look at also China's, in a way, interest in power balancing. Does it want to remain the ally forever, as it has promised, of a Russia that may be poorer and poorer, more and more unruly, more and more, in a way, enfant terrible of the international system, or does it perhaps want to do more with the West? I mean, China is the big powerful joker in this game, in a way, and we should in the West try to bring China to our side if possible. This is akin to the Cold War, where the Soviet Union, China, and the West had these possibilities of balancing each other. So I think we right now there's an axis of, I shouldn't say evil. I'm not an American politician who uses these terms, but it's rather tempting. North Korea, Iran, and Russia plus China. It's a sort of axis powers, at least, that we have to deal with. But it's not set in stone that China will be in this group in the future. So I think trading and political relations, all with full knowledge of what goes on, and that you may cooperate in one area and have a conflict in another.
And the Chinese are willing to use our dependence as political weapons.
Yeah, they will try to test us and see. I mean, if you're an expert in China, you're from Canada or Australia, you may be arrested on charges of espionage, as it is useful to have these hostages to negotiate with. So then its business becomes politicized, and that's a real risk for some nations.
For a long time, the special relationship with the UK and US has been stabilized in our part of the world anyway. In the last few years, we've had, 5 different prime ministers, and we might see a comeback of Trump next year. How worried should we be about for 2024? Odd-Lari, would you, any ideas?
Well, I think it's fully possible that Trump is re-elected, especially now the Middle East conflict plays into domestic American politics, with sort of the very left part of the Democratic Party being extremely pro-Palestinian and creating sort of support for the Republicans that are standing by Israel. So there are things happening that play into this. Although the polls indicate that Biden will win, we don't know that. But we have to plan with Trump as president, because we always have to plan with the worst scenario, for the worst scenario. So it means that Europe has to be much more able to take responsibility for its own fate, its own role, have a leading role. This is, in a way, we should have led ourselves and had much more of a regional leading role a long time ago. I mean, the Americans have been right in pointing to our lack of defense spending, lack of willingness to lead internationally, always leaning on the US while criticizing the US. So we need the US, this special relationship that Sir Winston invented and pleaded for and really realized. It is so special, said Helmut Kohl, that only the British had heard of it. He was quipping. But this is a reality in intelligence, in military affairs, and this is what we are, in a way, benefiting so much from here in Norway. NATO was created, as you know, in 1949, 4th of April, sign the Washington Treaty, and that was partly because Norway was pleading with the British government, please try to get the Americans to sign on to this Atlantic Pact, because we are very unsure how the Soviets are planning. What are they planning? So we were so afraid of the Soviet Union at that time and really wanted this. And Britain is our closest ally, of course, in NATO and in general. So this is, we have a new book coming with Hurst in London in February on these alliances within the alliance. And that is now really clear after with the Ukraine war, how we now have Russia as the strategic threat to us, and therefore can integrate much more under British leadership, nor the countries in NATO looking to Britain, and Britain, of course, close to Washington. So Northern Europe becomes more important, and we become much more integrated. This is a sort of continuation from before World War II.
I know you all hate this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How would Winston Churchill, how would he have reacted to Brexit?
He knows the answer.
Yeah, that guy over there.
Well, I've been covering British politics since 1992, the landslide of John Major. And since then, in every election, in every political discourse in the UK, now the Brexit, of course, there was always this question: what would Winston Churchill have said? What would William Shakespeare have said? None of them were around. I'm pretty sure that this is going to be a bit strange, because now I'm going to quote your mother. I went to a lecture, I heard Andrew Roberts' presentation, it was a book presentation, and he quoted your mother in that question. And she said, never assume that you know what Papa would have said under any circumstances, especially what happened after his death. So that's it.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant wrap-up. Any questions? This is the time. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your participation in this panel, and especially to you, Ms. Soames, for coming to Norway. So, Churchill was famous for building strong personal relationships. We have seen that with Roosevelt, even with Stalin. Do you think personal relationship has outplayed its role in international politics? Or is it still of relevance?
I think it's absolutely relevant, because it's so much easier to do political business with other people if you know them just as business. Take an example around government's very close relation with Germany. A little bit off topic here, but Germany is emerging probably as one of the, we have a strong relation with UK traditionally, and militarily, from much more than with the Germans. But in today's situation, with Germany as the biggest economy in Europe, our biggest customer when it comes to gas, and the biggest power in Europe.
You know what chamber you're in now, right?
Yeah. Well, that was a
I'm just going to
that was a
remind.
practical case, right? I said it was a little bit, on the side here, just as an example. I think that's tremendously important for Norway as long as we're outside EU, together with another country.
Yeah.
We need strong partners in the EU, and we need strong partners to handle America and their policies when it comes to Inflation Reduction Act and other policies, where if we are not along
Now
with...
you're arguing in terms of interest, aren't
Yeah,
you?
but
Not because Olaf Scholz is so...
My point is that, the personal relations are definitely important to achieve what we wish there. No doubt. Thanks.
We got time for one more question. Anybody? Yes.
Russia has spent a massive amount of its GDP on nuclear weapons, tactical, massive nuclear weapons, yet we hear very little of their relevance in Ukraine. What does the panel think, and maybe what would have Churchill done in that context?
He didn't have nuclear weapons, but I can start out. We were definitely very concerned at the outset of the war, right? Because they started up with all these nuclear threats. We have heard these threats now for almost 2 years. We think it's highly unlikely they will use them. Their strategic nuclear weapons, those, the huge intercontinental missiles, are there to prevent any other country from threatening them with nukes. The tactical ones that you could fire into a field in Ukraine or so on are, I'm not going to go into all the scenarios, but the point is that when you start looking at it, it's militarily not very useful. And they would then destroy an area that they actually want to occupy. They will lose all support from China, India, and other countries. So they more or less stopped talking about it. Occasionally, some of the other leaders in Russia, not the president, are mentioning this. I think that's more to get on the news and get the attention from the president and actually sending a real signal.
Thank you very much. Please don't leave, because I know Nina has a surprise, but thank you for coming. Please stay for the mingling. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Emma Soames. Thank you, DLA Piper and International Churchill Society. I'm going to read one last quote. Listen to this. Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because it is the quality that guarantees all others. Have a nice evening.